Hello there, Evie here. Welcome to an air-cooled build on the Raijintek Styx. Now I'm going to leave the intro at that because this video has gone way too long already. We're over 20 minutes, our target is 15, so it's blown out of the water. I'll catch you in a second for some narration. At the end there's quite a lot of thermal testing to get the right setup to find the sweet spot for this case. Bit demanding, but you'll find that out at the end. And at the end there's some B-roll footage, of course, and a wrap up with some personal opinions of mine about the case. But let's move on to the core part, the build. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in a second. There's so much to cover with this case that we'll need to skim over a few of the lesser important details. So this case comes in a cardboard box wrapped in a plastic bag and bookended by a couple of polystyrene molds. The finish of this case is described by Raijintek as a hair silk anodized aluminium, but I think it's a lot easier to think of it as a deeper than average brushed aluminium with an anodized colour finish, which in this option is green. A nice detail is the beveled hard edge, which is just as functional as it is good looking. Anodized aluminium is so easy to scuff, and the edges are a prime place to accidentally damage. The front of this case is completely closed off with a thematic brushed green aluminium panel, where we can find the power button, which is really nicely nested into the panel. Up top we can find the front I/O, which consists of two USB 3.0 ports and separate headphone and microphone jacks, which again are nicely incorporated into the top panel. Speaking of which, incorporated into the top panel is a relatively large filter, which we'll look into more in a few minutes. Since this is a case with a side panel window, let's check out that window. This is one of the slightly more disappointing parts of this case since it's so small, but there's a good reason for that which you'll get a fuller picture of later on. An interesting detail is that the window panel is connected to the side panel with just 4 sets of nuts and bolts. It's such a simple idea but works really well. Moving to the rear of the case, there's a slightly unconventional layout. The top of the case has 2 ports for tubing and a power supply unit pass-through, but no space for the power supply unit. Just beneath are 5 PCI Express cover slots with a connector cover, and a ventilation overflow section to the left. And right at the bottom we have a 120mm fan position with an included rear fan, and the motherboard rear I/O slot is to the right. So let's take a look at the inside of the case. To get all the panels off in this case, there are between 4 and 6 small black screws that need removing. Normally I remove the offside panel, which happens to reveal the main compartment of the case, but in this case that's actually to the back of the motherboard tray. To get to the main compartment you need to open up the other side panel, which obviously makes sense since that's where the side panel window is. Speaking of which, I wanted to show you a view of the inside of these panels just so you know. Here you can find the nuts that are holding the side panel window on. There's 1 bolt for each nut, apart from one of them which has 2, which was either a mistake or is an extra one just in case. On this side panel you can also find a fabric strip that leads through to a placement for a slim optical disk drive. To remove the top panel requires the removal of a total of 6 screws. Note that both side panels need removing before the top panel can be removed. Since there seems to be a really high emphasis on the style of this case being extremely clean, there aren't many alternatives, but many cases that aren't as highly strung have similar layouts. After all the screws were removed, there was a little resistance removing the top panel. I wasn't sure if it was caused by connecting wires, so I was a little cautious, but it actually ended up being the sides of the top panel that were clamping onto the internal brackets. Anyway, let's take a quick pass of the top panel before we move on. There is of course a top filter that would suggest that the top should be an intake, but we'll be working this out later on during testing. Either way, it can be removed from the inside of the top panel by pushing on 2 clips to one side of the panel. The top panel itself can hold 1 or 2 120mm fans with accompanying radiators, nothing more or less though. I thought I'd mention the manual that comes with the case. It's actually very well illustrated with decent but minimal instructions to boot, a very well appreciated inclusion. And in terms of included extras such as screws, we have as follows. 4 optical disk drive screws, 8 short 2.5-inch drive screws, 8 motherboard screws, 8 long 2.5-inch drive screws, 4 power supply unit screws, 12 3.5-inch drive screws, 4 rubber pads for an optical disk drive, a motherboard speaker, and a couple of slim cable ties. Shifting back to the case, we have this pretty interesting chassis panel. Now it's not technically a chassis panel, but it certainly helps with the strength of the case. You may notice that there isn't actually a chassis, the panels are what holds this thing together. But in terms of what this panel can do, it's essentially a drive bracket. Showing you in a rather crude way, it can essentially hold 2 2.5-inch drives, one either side, which we'll check out later. But looking at it, I think this could have easily been upgraded to 3 2.5-inch drives if they were mounted vertically with a few more holes. You'll see my need for this approach later. This bracket can also take two 3.5-inch drives, which makes me so much more convinced that it could easily have fitted three 2.5-inch drives. Moving on, this panel can be taken out by removing 4 screws, and I'll be testing whether this thing can take a water cooling build without this panel in a future video. So with the case as open as it'll get, you can see the bottom of the case can take a 3.5-inch drive or a 120mm fan, and the power supply unit position is to the front of the case, utilising the power supply unit pass-through cable to retain a rear power connection. To the front of the case is where a slim optical disk drive can be installed between the two horizontal brackets, and following the group of cables up to the top is where the front I/O PCB is positioned. The question is the green PCB green because it matches the case, or because it's cheaper than black? Okay, it's clearly green to save costs, but it's out of the way from view, so it really doesn't matter. Since we've seen the top of the case already, we can take a quick look at the rear from the inside, which has a 3-pin rear fan which can ramp up to 1300 RPM, and is actually pretty quiet, so there's no need to replace it. And I'd like to point out quickly that the removable PCI Express slot covers are not tool-free, as the Raijintek website would suggest. The motherboard tray is interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it necessitates an upside down motherboard installation, and also because all of the standoffs are pre-installed, which is always good for a quick build. Going around to the back of the motherboard tray, there's not a lot to take note of, apart from the two 2.5-inch drive brackets, which we'll look more into a little later. But let's move on and flip this thing onto its side and get building. Alright, I'm just having a little think through the fan situation here and airflow. Now, everybody's going to have their own opinion as to what the best airflow is, and it would take more than just a week or so for me to make this video if I had to include all the different styles of airflow and how they worked. But the included fan is set up with an exhaust to the rear, which to me seems a little unusual, since when you put in all of your stuff, you're going to have a rear exhaust fan there. The fan on the power supply unit is going to be intaking, and it's going to be there. So that's going to be an intake there and exhaust here. So you've got two exhausts right next to each other pointing in different directions, and that just seems odd. And then you're going to have your cooler on, well, there. It's going to be right in the middle here, and it's going to be either blowing that way or that way, and it's going to be fighting either of these two. So it would make sense from this point to turn this fan around and have that intaking air here, going through the heatsink, two fans here, through into the power supply unit and back out here. So we have a continuous chain of air flowing through. Then we're going to have two, funny enough at the top, two fans at the top here, bringing air in, which will basically just be giving air to the graphics card, which if we slot in very quickly... well, that's not going in the top slot. Okay, well there's a bump. This is not going to be... oh no. Right. So you might want a smaller maybe a smaller power supply unit as well. 100mm power supply unit, maybe, and a smaller graphics card. That's not good. No. Okay, well this is my amount of forethought in some of these videos. I knew I should have bought an SFX power supply unit before I started doing these small videos. And I was so close to buying one the other day. Oh jeez. Well, it's clearly not going to fit in now with the large graphics card and the large power supply units. It's not even a large one. I mean, it's 160mm. That's generally the average size ATX power supply unit, and this can fit an ATX power supply unit in. It is part of its spec. I clearly did not see a limitation on a GPU. I will check if that is around, if there is an ATX power supply unit in. But the course of action we have to take now is... would you look at that, a mysterious package. Well, obviously I know what's in the package, but for your information, we have a Corsair SF600. This is a small form factor, or SFX, power supply unit. It is 100mm long, much smaller than the 160mm power supply unit that I have here. Now, because it's an SFX power supply unit, you can't just have that by itself to fit into an ATX compatible power supply space. So I have a Silverstone, apparently a PP08, but this is a ATX or SFX2 ATX power supply unit adapter, and that's what you'll need to get a 100mm long power supply unit into here to be able to fit in your full-size graphics card. So, without further ado, let's build this thing. So after that delay, let's start things off with the motherboard. Now the installation of the motherboard is super simple in this case, since it's mostly open and all of the standoffs are pre-installed. I'd like to quickly reiterate and clarify that as long as your power supply unit is under 130mm, that's taking into account the cables that have to exit the power supply unit as well, you can fit any size graphics card up to 330mm. You don't need an SFX power supply unit to do this. A power supply unit such as the Corsair VS650 is a 650 watt ATX power supply unit that's only 125mm tall. But if you have a power supply unit over 130mm, you'll need a GPU that's under 250mm long. I'd also quickly like to mention that this isn't an advertisement for Corsair power supply units, it's just the first ATX power supply unit that I came across that is less than 130mm. The cables on the VS power supply units are actually fixed, so I couldn't recommend them for this case. That should balance things out a little. So with the motherboard and RAM installed, let's take a stab at installing that power supply unit. First off, of course, we need to install the power supply unit adapter bracket to the power supply unit. Again, this one is the Silverstone PP08, which comes with a set of low-profile screws to attach to the power supply unit. And just to hammer home that this isn't a sponsor, high pot okay. I'm sorry, but after seeing that, I really couldn't not point it out. It's like made in China all over again. Anyway, installing the bracket to the power supply unit is super simple. It just takes a second to work out which orientation you want to install it into the case. I'm initially installing this with the overflow ventilation section offsetting the power supply unit closer to the edge of the case, but this ends up changing for reasons which we'll explore later. With the adapter bracket installed, we now have an ATX compatible power supply unit which we can lower into the ATX power supply unit bracket on the case. Fixing it to the case is pretty simple, but it's worth pointing out that you'll need a relatively slender screwdriver to make it through the hole next to the triangular rubber foot on the case. I'd recommend leaving the connection of the angled pass-through power supply unit connector until just before you're going to turn the system on. Once it's in, it's a nightmare to get back out if you need to move the power supply unit for whatever reason. More on that later. So with the power supply unit in place, let's sort out the ventilation of the case. For now, I'm flipping the included fan around to create an intake as described earlier. However, I will be flipping this back later to find the best ventilation setup for this case with all this hardware. As for the Hyper 212 Evo CPU cooler, we're installing both 2200 RPM fans to move the air from the rear intake towards the power supply unit exhaust. An interesting point about the power supply unit is Corsair says it's rated to output only 40 degrees C at continuous load, which will be far lower than the heat output from the CPU and the graphics card, and the capacitors, like most, are rated for 105 degrees C, so there's no chance of overheating it. Now for some work on the I/O cables. I went for a more complicated routing option of getting the cables to the back of the motherboard tray through the closest slot, which is actually some sort of large loop, but I don't really see a use for it here. The connection of the cables is pretty simple since there's plenty of room to work with, but I would like to see slightly more space behind the motherboard tray for the cables to cross over each other. Not every cable is the perfect length for all of them to run parallel to each other behind the motherboard tray. Now back onto the 2.5-inch drive brackets to the rear. Installing the 2.5-inch drive into them is super simple. The bracket only needs 2 screws removing to take it out, and to install the drive it only requires 4 screws to be installed through the back. Then the bracket with the attached drive can be offered up to the rear of the motherboard tray, and 2 screws can be replaced to secure it in. Super simple. As for wiring everything in, apart from the other drives and the graphics card, I purchased these really small PWM hubs from Amazon to deal with all the fans. They can deal with a total of 5 fans, and their speed is dictated between the CPU fan curve and the fan in the CPU header position. Connecting it to the motherboard was a little challenging since the space beneath the Micro ATX motherboard in this case is microscopic, and of course there is a big cooler in the way. Since there isn't even enough room to fit this small fan hub behind the motherboard tray, I found the best place to store it was behind the power supply unit. So at the moment we have 2 fans on the cooler and a fan to the rear. We're going to start testing in this configuration since it's relatively balanced, but later we'll be fitting all the fan slots with fans. Alright, so here's where things go downhill pretty fast, and it's not really the case's fault. Since this power supply unit is designed for mini ATX cases, all of the connectors are pretty short. Actually, they're really short. So there's no way the SATA cable is going to be able to reach to the back and the front, so we're removing the hard disk drive from the back of the motherboard tray. We'll connect and route all of the power cables for now, but this will change later. Trying to route the CPU power connector behind the motherboard tray through the lower hole was a no-go. There's just too much motherboard in the way. So it needs to go underneath the cooler in the main compartment, which was really awkward with the cooler in, so I'd recommend installing the cooler later on in the build. This isn't a great look, but it could be worse. So let's naively move on to the graphics card installation. You'll get the naivety in a couple of minutes. I can only assume the tool-free expansion slot was referring to the cover of the PCI Express slot covers, not the cover panels themselves. Anyway, at least with the SFX power supply unit, we can now get the graphics card into the by 16 top PCI Express slot, or bottom now the motherboard is inverted. Since this case is still open and accessible, the installation was really simple. I'm actually preferring the upside down motherboard orientation, but there's not a lot of clean ventilation around the CPU area. Now the GPU is in place and secured, it just needs some power and then we can move on to the drives. Okay, so just before we get into this section, I'd like to warn you, be prepared for a straight 2 minutes of drive installation complications. So with the drive bracket, 2 of the 3 2.5-inch drives can be mounted using the longer 2.5-inch drive screws that come with the case. This was simple enough, but this is not the final step of these drives. No, that would be way too simple. So after replacing the drive bracket with 4 screws, we need to connect power to the 2 drives, and bear in mind there is still a 3rd drive to place and connect. This is where things get challenging. Due to the ATX size SATA power connector from the Corsair SF600, the connection between the 2 2.5-inch hard disk drives is too long. This is one of the problems I think could have been fixed by having 3 vertical positions for 2.5-inch drives. Another problem I have is between the case and the power supply unit. Since the drives are mounted flush against the panel, there is very little tolerance for a power connector, and due to the connector style of the SATA power cable, the rear cap of the connector needs to be removed, which exposes the wire connectors from the back. Not really dangerous, but it increases the potential for issues. So back to the drawing board. To give potentially a little more flexibility with the SATA cable, I decided to turn the power supply unit around to get the SATA connector closer to those drives. This was a serious pain in the butt, since I had to dismantle the majority of the system to rotate the power supply unit, and bear in mind I spent about 10 minutes removing the power supply unit connector, so again, plug that in last. So after rebuilding the system, nothing really changed. I couldn't change the way the connectors were traveling between the components. It was closer than before, but not close enough. So a bit of out-of-the-box thinking was needed, something potentially dangerous. So here's the plan. We're going to take both SSDs and link them together for a space-efficient connection, and then we're going to fix them to the ventilation overflow section to the rear of the chassis. Strangely enough, the spacing between the holes is absolutely perfect to screw in SSDs. Now I know this is going to make so many people cringe, well that's really dependent on whether YouTube will actually suggest this video, but for reference on whether this is a relatively strong connection, I thought I'd slap the drives about a bit. Not too hard, but enough to rock the chassis. Clearly this is a strong enough connection to hold a couple of SSDs. Sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do, and if it works, and pretty well in this case. So moving on without anyone lecturing me in the comments about how ridiculous I am for risking my data with such an insecure connection. Seriously, don't be ludicrous. The hard disk drive is fully secured to the drive panel and can be linked to one of the power connectors from the power supply unit cable. So now we have our full setup, we just need to replace all of the exterior brushed aluminium panels, starting with the top panel, which just looking at it from the footage looks fantastic. Next up we have the solid side panel, which was a little fiddlier due to the small rear motherboard section for the cable management. I think this motherboard tray could really have been moved inwards 5mm more. I mean, this case can support a 180mm CPU cooler, which is insanely large, and I would rather trade 5mm of that cooler for more cable management space. Anyway, lastly we have the windowed side panel, again not amazingly easy to put back on. It is easier to lay the case down on its side, but the finish of this case is pretty delicate, so gingerly holding the panel against the case is another option. So with the panel returned to the case, let's look at the standard thermal testing results. So here's the thing, With the system being a 91 watt i7-6700K and a thermally inefficient R9 390X graphics card, both ended up thermal throttling. Both the CPU and the GPU lasted around 8.5 minutes of testing with Prime 95 and Combustor before the CPU turned the multiplier down to 39 times and the GPU was down by 100 MHz, so that's clearly a fail. But looking at the comparison chart, it's not the worst thermal throttling we've seen, which is impressive for the smallest case we've ever tested. So now we need to perform the second test, which is the max thermal test. This is where we add as many fans as possible to the case. Normally we would replace all stock fans with 2200 RPM fans, but we've had a couple of fan deaths over the last couple of months, so the best I could do is fill all the other slots with 2200 RPM EK Vardar fans and retain the included 1300 RPM to the rear. You should be able to tell how much of a pain in the butt it was to add in the bottom fan, which we've added in as an intake to supply air to the CPU cooler and the graphics card up top. And up top we're adding 2 fans as exhausts to remove air from the intakes below, but predictably this will have a negative impact on the graphics card since it would be fighting against its fans. The installation, however, was really easy, and fitting in a 240mm radiator in the upcoming water-cooled build is going to be awesome. Okay, so scrap that idea. The GPU was no better and the CPU wasn't any better either. So as an attempt to improve at least the GPU's thermal performance, I thought flipping the fan most isolated to the GPU would be a good idea. It would feed a strong stream of air into the graphics card, and the one of course on the other side would be exhausting the air after. But again, there are obvious problems here. Air cycling is one of them, as well as extracting the air before it even becomes effective. Damn it, so there wasn't much improvement over the last couple of tests. So we're going to go straight to the final setup, which performed better than the last 2 runs, but there's still so much more to improve from this setup. So we're going to go with 2 intakes at the top. Figuring that there's a filter at the top, maybe it's a hint at how it should be used, but it will be going against the natural flow of hot air rising, but the speeds of these fans will outdo that many times over. And the whole setup at the bottom has completely changed as well. We changed the rear fan to an intake like before, and the CPU fans were turned around to pull air from the rear intake. The bottom fan was changed to an exhaust. Maybe since the bottom fan doesn't have a filter, it was always intended as an exhaust. And since this setup inside the case is so complicated, I'm tempted to go with the hints from the manufacturer. So we ended up with a CPU that still thermal throttles, but remember this is full load and it took over 6 minutes to get there, which is actually not as long as it took in the standard test. We'll discuss that in a second. The GPU, however, dropped its temperature by 8 degrees C, which will be more important to most people. On the note of the worst thermals with more fans than less, I think this is down to that bottom fan. I think this is mainly down to an awkward GPU position which is cooled best with 2 top intakes, but this of course means that we're feeding hot air down into the CPU, which is clearly not as good for the CPU as fresh cooler air. And moving back onto that bottom fan, it's just in such an awkward position. It's not really that beneficial as an intake since it would just be preventing hot air from the GPU exiting the system. And as an exhaust, it's going to be taking air out of the system before it's had a chance to go through the CPU cooler. More hot air at say 60 degrees going through a CPU cooler is still better than less of that 60-degree air. More fans is not necessarily better, it still needs to be used in an effective way. Anyway, please enjoy some last views of the build and I'll catch you in a minute for some closing thoughts. So a couple of closing thoughts on this case. Well, I think overall it's not a bad case. Now, I think with a 91 watt processor like the 6700K, then you're going to be pushing it in terms of thermals. If you want this for some sort of rendering rig, video editing PC, some heavy workstation use, then it's really not going to be a system for you. Ideally, you want something with strong ventilation. This really is better suited to good looks and moderate performance. So that would be my final touch on that topic. I think the finish looks fantastic, but I am very tentative to misplace a panel somewhere or be too boisterous around it. I might drop something on it and it'll scratch, and it will scratch very easily, so be extremely careful of that. To build in, not too bad overall. I do find that drive bracket a pain in the butt. It really should have 3 hard disk drive slots for 2.5-inch hard disk drives. A bracket that can fit 3 or 2 3.5-inch hard disk drives and can only fit 2 2.5-inch hard disk drives makes no sense to me. So yeah, I'm gonna be water cooling this because I think it's an interesting case, and I think it's a perfect case and situation to water cool in this case. If it's not performing very well under your air-cooled loads, then sticking in a water cooling system for such a nice looking case like this would probably be a very sensible option. So we're going to be exploring that either next video or the video after. I might be changing something up for the next one. So if you would like to support the channel, then likes and dislikes, subscribe to help this channel get past the 1,000 subscriber mark before the end of February or the 20th of February, or YouTube is going to demonetize the channel, which is going to be a big blow to the channel. Check out this video to learn more about that situation. It's a bit of a hairy one. So yes, thank you so much for watching this video. If you have any comments or suggestions, leave them in the comments below and I'll pick them up. I generally answer pretty much all the comments that come through to me. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.